It was a bright and crisp morning when Jamila stepped into the airport, clutching her bag tightly. It was her first solo trip abroad, and she could barely contain her excitement. She had been dreaming of this moment for so long. This trip would mark the beginning of a new chapter in her life. Her parents were proud but worried, as any loving parents would be. Jamila, a young black girl, had never traveled alone before, but now, at the age of 20, she was ready. She had spent months planning, saving, and preparing, eager to experience the world outside her small hometown. The airport was bustling with travelers, the sounds of announcements echoing through the halls. Jamila's heart raced as she checked her ticket again, making sure she was at the right gate. She was headed to a foreign country, a place she had only seen in photos. Her flight was long, and she had read everything she could find about traveling alone, from tips on what to pack to how to stay safe in a new city. She was ready for this adventure, determined to make it a success. As she walked toward her gate, she couldn't help but notice the flight attendants preparing for the flight. They were all standing in neat rows near the gate, going through their final checks. Among them was Sarah, a woman in her mid-40s, with stern eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She had worked as a flight attendant for years and had become known for her sharp demeanor. Sarah prided herself on being efficient and no tolerance for disorder. It had earned her respect from her colleagues but also a few complaints from passengers who found her a bit too intense. Jamila found her seat on the plane and began settling in. The excitement was almost overwhelming. She looked out of the window, imagining the new places she would explore, the people she would meet, and the experiences that awaited her. She couldn't wait to finally feel the thrill of being somewhere new, far away from everything familiar. As more passengers boarded, Jamila's nerves began to settle. The cabin slowly filled up, and soon the plane was full. A few passengers were still trying to figure out where their seats were, causing a minor delay. Jamila, now buckled in and ready for takeoff, turned her attention to the flight attendants. Sarah, the one who had caught Jamila's eye earlier, was now walking down the aisle, making sure everything was in order. She was efficient, sharp, and seemed to have a keen eye for detail. As Sarah passed by Jamila's row, she noticed something: a small commotion in the aisle. A man was struggling to find his seat, his bag bumping into others. Sarah's face tightened, and she quickly walked over to him. There was no tolerance for disruption in her world. She gave the man a sharp look and instructed him to move quickly to his seat. Jamila, trying to stay out of the way, pulled her bag closer and tried to focus on her own space. She didn't want to draw attention to herself. But in the midst of all the movement, she had accidentally knocked over her water bottle. It fell from her lap and rolled across the floor, causing a slight disruption in the aisle. It wasn't a big deal, but Jamila's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't used to drawing attention, and she was suddenly aware of the flight attendants walking down the aisle. Sarah, walking right behind her, noticed the bottle on the floor. Sarah stopped. Her eyes locked onto the small water bottle, and then they moved up to Jamila. For a split second, there was silence. The other passengers were still settling in, but Jamila could feel Sarah's gaze on her. It felt like a judgment, something Jamila wasn't used to. She quickly bent down to pick up the bottle, but before she could, Sarah spoke, her voice cool and commanding. "Is this yours?" Sarah asked, her eyes narrowing. Jamila nodded, trying to explain that it had fallen by accident. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause any trouble," she said, her voice shaky. She hadn't intended to disrupt anything. She was just trying to get comfortable for the long flight ahead. But Sarah wasn't satisfied with the apology. She seemed to see it as another mistake, another reason to reprimand. She folded her arms and gave Jamila a look that sent a chill down her spine. "This is an airplane, not a playground," Sarah said sharply. "You need to be more careful." Jamila, feeling embarrassed and small, nodded again. She didn't know what to say. She had always been taught to be polite and respectful, but in this moment, she couldn't help but feel singled out, like she was being punished for something so insignificant. The flight attendants continued their rounds, making their final checks, but Jamila's mind was racing. She didn't want to be a problem passenger. She didn't want to be the cause of any delays or disruptions. But as the plane began to taxi down the runway, Jamila's mind kept returning to Sarah's words, and the feeling that she had done something wrong. Once the plane was in the air and the seat belt sign turned off, Jamila settled into her seat, trying to focus on the flight ahead. She pulled out her headphones and began to listen to some music, hoping to distract herself. But she couldn't shake off the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong, that something as small as knocking over a water bottle had made her a target in Sarah's eyes. She had heard stories of flight attendants who were tough on passengers, but she never imagined she would be on the receiving end of it. She had always thought of herself as an easygoing traveler, just trying to get to her destination with minimal hassle. But this flight, this experience, was already proving to be more than she had bargained for. As the flight continued, Jamila couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. She tried to shake it off, but it kept creeping back. Her mind wandered back to the way Sarah had looked at her. That piercing stare. The quick judgment. It was as if she had already decided Jamila was trouble before she had even spoken. Minutes passed. Jamila's eyes flicked nervously toward Sarah, who was now walking down the aisle, passing by rows of passengers, her demeanor still stiff and professional. It wasn't like Jamila could do anything now. The flight was underway, and she had no choice but to sit there and let the hours tick by. As the flight settled into the steady hum of the engines, Jamila tried to find a way to shake off the tension she had felt earlier. She wanted to enjoy the journey, to immerse herself in the excitement of the adventure ahead, but the events that had unfolded so far kept replaying in her mind. Every time she thought about Sarah's sharp words, a wave of anxiety rushed through her. The plane cruised smoothly, and the flight attendants began their rounds, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers. Jamila tried to focus on the movie she had picked, hoping it would distract her from the unease she felt. But no matter how hard she tried, her thoughts kept circling back to that brief but uncomfortable interaction with Sarah. It felt like all eyes were on her, even though she knew that was unlikely. She glanced out the window, watching as the clouds stretched out below her, the endless sea of white comforting in its consistency. It should have been peaceful, but it was hard to ignore the nagging feeling that something was still wrong. She had traveled all this way, and now, instead of feeling exhilarated, she felt as if she was carrying the weight of something she didn't deserve. As she sat there, trying to push the negative thoughts away, she noticed Sarah walking down the aisle again. The flight attendant was checking on the other passengers, but this time, Jamila felt her heart race as Sarah came closer. She had to fight the urge to shrink back into her seat, afraid that even the slightest movement would make her stand out. But Sarah walked past her row without saying a word. Jamila exhaled quietly, her body finally relaxing for the first time in what felt like hours. She tried to reassure herself that it was over. Maybe Sarah had forgotten about it. Maybe she was just doing her job and nothing more. But even as she thought this, Jamila couldn't completely rid herself of the discomfort that had settled deep within her. The rest of the flight was uneventful. Jamila tried to sleep, but her mind kept racing. She had expected the journey to be an exciting start to her travels, but now it felt tainted by the tension that had built up. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Sarah's face, stern and unapproachable, judging her for something so trivial. Time seemed to stretch on, and before long, the captain's voice crackled through the speakers, announcing that they would be beginning their descent. Jamila was grateful for the distraction, even if it was just the routine announcement. She stretched in her seat, trying to prepare herself for the landing. The excitement was finally starting to creep back in, slowly pushing away the heavy feelings that had overshadowed her journey so far. As the plane began its descent toward the airport, The seat belt sign lit up, and the flight attendants started making their final rounds, making sure everyone was securely fastened. Jamila was lost in her own thoughts when she heard footsteps approaching her row again. It was Sarah, but this time, her expression seemed different. "Excuse me, miss," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. "Can I see your passport?" Jamila's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to be asked for her passport again, especially after the earlier incident. She fumbled for a moment, feeling the pressure building. But she knew she had no choice. Slowly, she pulled out her passport and handed it to Sarah. Sarah's eyes scanned the passport briefly, her hands moving in a way that made Jamila feel like she was being judged once more. Jamila couldn't help but feel a lump form in her throat as Sarah examined the document. It was just a passport, just a simple piece of identification, but in that moment, it felt like more a symbol of the judgment she had been subjected to. Sarah held the passport for a moment longer than necessary. Then, without a word, she handed it back to Jamila. The whole exchange lasted no more than a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Jamila forced herself to smile, trying to show that everything was fine, but inside, she was shaking. As Sarah walked away, Jamila felt a rush of frustration build within her. She didn't understand why this was happening. What had she done wrong? She had followed the rules. She had been polite. She had done everything she was supposed to do, and yet it felt like she was being singled out. The flight attendants began preparing for landing, and soon the plane touched down smoothly. The rush of emotions Jamila had been trying to suppress began to bubble to the surface as the plane taxied to the gate. She wanted to get off the plane, to escape the feeling of being watched and judged, but she knew that wasn't possible. The reality of her situation was sinking in, and it wasn't something she could easily run from. When the plane finally came to a halt, the doors opened, and passengers began to disembark. Jamila stood, grabbed her bag, and made her way toward the exit, trying to avoid eye contact with anyone. As she stepped off the plane, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The flight was over, but the weight of what had happened lingered with her. But as she moved toward the terminal, something unexpected happened. She heard someone calling her name from behind. She turned around, and to her surprise, it was Sarah. The flight attendant had stopped her, and Jamila's heart sank. What could this be about? "Excuse me, miss," Sarah said, her voice lower now. "I wanted to apologize for earlier. I should have been more patient with you. It was a long flight, and I let my frustration get the best of me." Jamila stood there, taken aback. She hadn't expected an apology. She had prepared herself for more judgment or coldness, not the soft sincerity in Sarah's voice. "I didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable," Sarah continued, her face showing a hint of regret. "That wasn't fair to you." Jamila didn't know what to say. She had expected the worst, but now, seeing Sarah's vulnerability, the situation felt different. The tension that had been building up over the course of the flight seemed to evaporate in the face of this unexpected kindness. "Thank you," Jamila said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded and turned to walk away, leaving Jamila standing there, feeling a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite put into words. The apology wasn't what she had expected, but it was enough to help her see the situation in a different light. For the first time during the entire flight, Jamila felt a small spark of hope. Maybe the journey wasn't going to be as difficult as she thought. Maybe, just maybe, things could still turn out all right.